Maybanke Anderson's work. It is humbling beyond measure to be here and to join a list of esteemed leaders who have delivered this lecture in the past, from the incredible Professor Larissa Berendt, who's here tonight, to Adele Horan, Professor Marilyn Waring, Lucinda Brogden, Virginia Bell, Elizabeth Broderick. I stand here tonight on the shoulders of giants in shoes too big to contemplate, so we will just move on. Upon being invited to deliver this lecture, I was delighted and mortified in equal measure. How had I not heard of this extraordinary woman, Maybanke Anderson? A woman of formidable historic significance, who was once a household name to several generations of Australians, who is these days largely unknown. As you've heard from Jane, she was born in 1845 in England. She arrived in Sydney with her family at age 9. She was educated as a teacher. She was a woman who made things happen. As a teacher, a writer, a leader, an advocate, and a feminist. One of the many obituaries on her death in 1927 noted that Maybanke had a genius for initiating movements for educational and social betterment. That Australian women were able to vote in the new Commonwealth nearly 3 decades earlier than was possible for women in the United Kingdom was just one of Maybanke's legacies. She published and edited her own fortnightly paper, The Woman's Voice, which she described as being democratic but not revolutionary, womanly but not weak, fearless without effrontery, liberal without licence. In 1895, as you heard, she established the first free kindergarten in Australia, pioneering the movement for early childhood education and helping children and their working mothers. As Dr. Susan Fees noted in the 2014 Maybanke Lecture, Maybanke's own experience as a young wife, losing 4 of her 7 children and being deserted by her husband, led her in the early 1890s to campaign for desertion as grounds for women to divorce their husbands and to campaign for women's property rights. But having achieved that, she continued campaigning for a raft of social reforms, including women's suffrage and family planning. The thread that weaves together the various reforms Maybanke pursued is her concern with the education of children and young people. For the last 3 years, running The Parenthood, an independent advocacy organisation representing parents and carers, I've been singularly focused professionally on one of the causes that Maybanke Anderson identified as being fundamental to the well-being, safety and security of children and women in 1895. It's a cause that remains as pertinent today as it was over a century ago. That is the provision of totally affordable, quality early childhood education and care. It's a cause I have been variously passionate, incensed and consumed with for the last 12 years, almost to the very day. I am acutely aware, particularly in this room, that 12 years is the blink of an eye in the full history of campaigning for early childhood education and care in Australia. But before I get to that, I want to be explicit about this having been a professional pursuit for the past 3 years. Being paid to advocate and champion change isn't something to gloss over, because advocacy needs to be funded. The reality is that too many causes, particularly those connected to the rights of women and children, rely on the heroic, unpaid labour of mostly women who are already mostly stretched beyond their means, in time, in money, in power. These women are, like Maybanke Anderson, propelled by a profound sense of social justice. They cannot help but try to seek to right the wrongs they see. They go above and beyond their job descriptions every single day. They push the limits of their own time and energy to fight for change that is bigger than they are. But it comes at a cost. I'm thinking of women who work day in, day out with refugees, in domestic violence shelters, in women's legal services, in juvenile justice, in schools, in health, in hospitals, in schools, in our communities. Women who in their day jobs see the symptoms of systemic flaws and devote their unpaid labour to rattling the cage in pursuit of broader structural reforms. I have seen up close the toll this advocacy takes, and it's not pretty. Being paid to advocate a cause does not erase the human cost associated, but it is a fundamentally different proposition than relying on the unfunded voluntary goodwill of time-poor women. So tonight I do want to pay tribute and thank the organisations and individuals who financially support the Parenthood. The last 3 years have been hugely consequential in relation to policies pertaining to early childhood education and care in Australia. The huge shift that we've seen in attitudes and expectations and policies was partly driven by the pandemic. But in my view, it is no accident that the last 3 years have been as consequential as they have been. In the last 2 years, $55 billion has been committed to early childhood education and care reform by Commonwealth, state and territory governments. Tonight, we have a Member of Parliament here, Sarah Mitchell, who was the Education Minister under the previous New South Wales government, and I would like to pay tribute to the work that she did in making the historic bipartisan commitment that the New South Wales government made with the Victorian government last year. The fact that 55, I can't actually see you, I know she is here. There she is, hiding at the back. Thank you, Sarah. The funding that has been put on the table is a reflection, in my view, of what's possible when coordinated, collaborative advocacy is funded. It's not that the evidence or the cause about investing in early years is new, far from it. What is new is that for the 3 years I've been in this role at the Parenthood, we've been part of a nationally coordinated and collaborative campaign called Thrive by 5. It is led by Jay Weatherill, the former South Australian Premier, and it is funded by the Minderoo Foundation. There are now 90 campaign partners, ranging from the Telethon Kids Institute, SNAKE, Good Start Early Learning, United Workers Union, Chief Executive Women, Royal Far West, Early Childhood Australia, and so many more. There are almost 100,000 supporters. In the last 3 years, the campaign has funded collaboration, research projects, advertising, communications. The campaign produced the most watched TED Talk of 2021. And when I say most watched, I mean the most watched in the world. And it's an incredible TED Talk by a young girl called Molly, and I suggest you watch it if you haven't. Thrive by 5 has been an umbrella under which individuals and organisations invested in better outcomes for children, communities and families have come together. The mantra from day one was simple: many voices, one message. The message that Australia needs universal access to quality early childhood education and care that is delivered by a properly paid and supported workforce. There are quite literally billions and billions of reasons to support this. And as a campaign, we have sought to coalesce around as many as humanly possible. Before I delve further into what has been achieved and what comes next, I want to explain how I came to be here. Agitating for political and policy change has been a professional pursuit for the last 3 years, but this cause is deeply personal. It is 12 years, almost to the day, since I first came face to face with the reality of early childhood education and care in Australia. My husband and I were living overseas when we had our first child, a delightful daughter who has just literally turned 13. We were living in the UK for 2 years while my husband did his master's overseas. A few months before we were due to come back to Sydney from the UK, I was offered a job back on BRW magazine, the business magazine I had left before. It was a maternity leave cover role, 4 days a week, and I couldn't have been more delighted. Having had a very brief legal career before a pretty devastating breakdown at age 25, the joy, purpose and satisfaction I derived from my first role as a junior reporter was immense. Nick and I were youngish parents at 27, and we were both very much in the formative junior stages of our careers. Our firstborn was a little over 1 when we were due to come home, and we had assumed quite naively that we would find a spot in daycare for her 4 days a week somewhere near where we lived. Neither of us had parents living in Sydney, so recruiting grandparents to help with childcare wasn't an option. Engaging a nanny even a day a week at that stage in our working lives was entirely out of reach financially. Having sent off a swag of emails to different daycares, it became apparent very quickly that we had been dreaming. Finding daycare was going to be near impossible. The wait lists were such that perhaps in 18 months they could take our daughter 1 day a week. For a good few weeks, it seemed that finding a spot was going to be beyond us, and we didn't really know what that would mean. It felt like we had hit the jackpot when we woke up one morning to an email from a Montessori nursery offering us 4 days a week. That it was located in the CBD, and neither Nick or I worked in the CBD, wasn't ideal. That it cost $165 a day wasn't dreamy, but it was a place in a wonderful service 4 days a week that gave us both the ability to work while our daughter was beautifully cared for and supported. Logistically,
Hey, gentle
was
Pokemon.
a nightmare. We had to catch the bus into the city with a toddler, drop her off before making our own way 20 minutes either side of the city to our own place of work. And we'd do the same in the afternoon. The cost was also diabolical. So at the time, the childcare subsidy was described as a 50% rebate, which we believed it was. Not reading the fine print was a sad realisation. It was only 50% up until $7,500. So after 3 months, because of the high daily fee, our subsidy ran out. So we were then out of pocket $2,640 a month. That first year, our out-of-pocket fees for one child were $26,820. That was more than, at the time, private school, but there was no alternative. It was a watershed experience. I couldn't unsee this barrier. Suddenly, I could see how this would be playing out. I knew that our experience wasn't isolated. I knew that our experience would be compounded and amplified in households and families across the country. I knew that it was easy to dismiss women's choice as the reason why men and women had different working patterns. As a journalist, I wrote about it as a major structural impediment to women's workforce participation. As a mum who did what a lot of mums back in 2010 did, which was start a blog, I blogged about it. Now, at this point, I have to confess that I was fortunate and naive enough to grow up believing that gender equality was basically sorted. I had been to an all-girls school. I was raised in a family where my parents were very equal. They raised my sister, my brother and I as equals. I knew at uni there were more women than there were men in the degree I was doing. The bubble obviously began to burst upon entering the professional world. Prior to us moving overseas and having our first baby, I had my curiosity about gender equality properly piqued for the first time. I interviewed Liz Broderick, who was the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the time. She explained the gap between women's educational attainment in Australia and workforce participation. Now, at that point in 2008, I almost laugh now because this seems like it was fantastic, but just stay with me. At that point, Australia ranked #1 in the world for educating women and girls, but we ranked 22nd in the world for economic participation. In 2021, that gap had grown. Australia had maintained the #1 rank for educating women and girls every single year, but we ranked 70th for women's workforce participation. Back in 2008, that statistic that Liz shared with me was theoretically fascinating. But by 2011, after having a baby, the theory was ripped away. This was why men and women were on such markedly different paths after starting a family. It all made sense. As a legal reporter, I had attended a number of workshops, conferences and roundtables where the focus was on how firms could retain their female talent. This wasn't reserved only for law firms. It was happening right across professional services. It was happening in boardrooms. There was a degree of bewilderment and mystery in these discussions. Women were studying law in really high numbers. They were entering law firms. They were being admitted. They were rising into senior associate positions, and then they were leaving. I had figured out the mystery was solved. Guys, it was not a great secret. Women weren't failing to enter the equity partnership ranks or the ASX executive pipeline in their same numbers as their male counterparts for any amorphous reasons. It was because they were still quite literally holding the baby. Between my blog, reporting for BRW, social media, and our family life, my fascination with all matters pertaining to how families could combine work and care grew. Back in the year 2013, I didn't have a public profile, but thanks to what really was the most profoundly remarkable and transformative website for ideas and connections, Twitter, in circles interested in gender, I was known. And I don't say that lightly. Twitter was honestly my favourite website. It is no longer that, but it really was. Being known for an interest in gender proved useful for me. I was on parental leave with our second daughter, Lulu, who really wanted to speak tonight, but I said no. I was on parental leave when I received a private message through Twitter that made my heart skip a beat. Marina Go, a woman I had admired from afar but had never met, asked if I would meet her for coffee. She was working at private media at the time and was the publisher of a new online publication that I adored called Women's Agenda. I said, Nick, if she wants to talk, that's my husband, if about a job at Women's Agenda, I will die and go to heaven. And I died and went to heaven because Marina wanted to talk to me about the possibility of stepping in as acting editor in a few months' time when the founding editor, Angela Priestley, was heading on parental leave with her first baby. And the best bit came next. Marina said, now, you have 2 tiny children, the tiniest of whom was cradled in my arm feeding at the time. And she said, I know finding childcare is a nightmare. So can you please have a think about how you think we could make this role work for you? And that right there was a sliding door moment in which my career, not just a job, became viable. I was offered unconditional trust, support, and flexibility from the get-go. At a point in life, it is so desperately needed and so often not extended. I was free to try and design a work week that was actually viable for our family. This was a possibility only because Marina herself had lived it. She was the editor of a magazine with 2 very young children. Her husband and her both managed work and their family, largely because she had a dad who was able to move from the Blue Mountains down to Sydney to be their nanny effectively. She knew it was possible to work and be a parent, but that it might not always look the same way. The flexibility she offered me was particularly valuable at that moment because my husband was working as a surgical registrar at a hospital over an hour away and had not even the faintest whiff of flexibility or agency. He left home before 6 a.m. and was very rarely home before 7 p.m. In addition, he was on call 3 weekends out of 4 in a month. These hours were not optional. I should flag he actually does really enjoy our children and our family. At least he says so. He was trying to qualify for a surgical training program, and jobs like these were the only way to make that happen. So Marina offered me and us a lifeline in so many ways. I often wonder how the world would look if all parents of young children were greeted with such acceptance and support from their managers upon seeking to return to work after starting a family. Marina was right though, childcare was a nightmare. Even trying to arrange 2 days of care for our youngest proved nearly impossible. Our eldest was at that stage attending an amazing KU service, and I feel like I need to say that in tribute to Maybanke Anderson. It was a KU service that we absolutely loved. Our eldest was attending 3 days a week, but that service couldn't offer a place for our youngest until the next year. We managed to track down a spot in a family daycare, but it was in another suburb. And I lasted 2 weeks of trying to do a ludicrous double drop-off with a 9-month-old and a toddler in 2 different suburbs before making my way to work. The moment actually at which that I had to pull the pin was the second week. Both children were sick and we were spending so much money for services that the kids could not even go to, and I was like, this is not going to work. So we bit the bullet and we hired the most delightful, divine nanny 3 days a week. We were paying her more than the total of even one of our salaries. But until we could get our youngest into the same service as our eldest, it was the only way I could accept the job offer of my dreams. We took the short-term financial hit. It was an investment in our family's future, and I know how privileged we were and are to be able to have that choice. It wasn't just an investment in our family's financial future. It was an investment in our social and emotional well-being. But the irony of almost not being able to take a dream job on a proud publication focused on delivering news for women due to the inaccessibility and unaffordability of early childhood education and care wasn't lost on me. My first editorial wrote itself. To me, it was so bleedingly obvious that women couldn't dream of finding any footing, let alone equal footing, without the provision of affordable, accessible early childhood education and care. 12 months later, we moved across the bridge in search of additional living space. Our family had outgrown the 2-bedroom apartment we had rented for almost 2 years, and we nabbed ourselves a little cottage with a backyard to rent on the other side of the city. It was heaven in every way except one. We couldn't get the girls into an early learning and care service in our new suburb.
Hello, Perry Pascal.
The only option was to keep them in the wonderful KU service on the other side of the bridge. So 6 times a week, I packed 2 children under 4 into the car before 7:30 a.m. to deliver them to the divine educators at KU a little after 8 before embarking on my way to the office. It felt like a daily endurance test, getting the 3 of us fed, dressed and out the door before 7:30 a.m. The car ride there and back involved games, snacks, songs and so many big feelings. I'd arrive at the office feeling shattered, but also happy. The easiest part of my life at that point was sandwiched between the hours of 8:30 and 5:30 p.m. Back in 2014, I extended an open invitation in writing to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, to come on one of my car rides, just one morning, just to experience it. It will shock you to learn the invitation wasn't accepted. But I wrote that invitation out of desperation. I wanted someone in a position of power to see up close how little choice existed. I knew our experience wasn't isolated. Trying to piece together care for our girls with work was a patchwork that felt desperately precarious. And yet without it, life would have become more precarious in different ways. Our intent, that was informed by both necessity and desire, was to invest in 2 careers. We didn't want all the eggs in one basket. But even trying to keep 2 sets of feet on the ladder felt comically hard. Without family on hand, nor an executive salary between us to cover a nanny, there was no margin for error. We both needed to work, but perversely, it felt like we couldn't afford that. And as I said before, we were, as we remain, incredibly privileged. We were both confident and comfortable enough to back our future, which meant, while tight, we could take the short-term financial hit. But the near impossibility of the junction between work and family collided with my professional purpose. Women's Agenda was unapologetic and relentless in its application of a gender lens on the news and in seeking to combat that. Gender inequity wasn't a concept we were willing to accept as inevitable. It was a deliberate choice, and we wanted that choice changed. We wrote daily about sexism, harassment, the underrepresentation of women in decision-making roles, the sexist tropes that trapped women, violence against women, and all of the manifestations and interconnections between those inequities. And day in, day out, we wrote that none of this would ever change by accident. We were never going to stumble upon a more gender equal country in which women could enjoy the same degree of safety, respect, and equity as men. It would only happen by dismantling the systemic barriers that hold women down and back. Pursuing evidence-based structural reform was the only path. The evidence was, as it remains, incontrovertible, And yet it seemed that there was almost zero appetite or interest to recognise this, let alone deal with it substantively. We had a finance minister who openly described gender equity as a side issue. The entrenched inequity itself was only part of the problem. The denial and dismissal felt just as seismic and maddening. The frustration and impotence I felt back then for myself, as well as families and the country, planted the seeds from which my advocacy has grown. It's how I came to be in the role I've held for the last 3 years at the helm of The Parenthood. I first became aware of The Parenthood in 2013 when it was first founded, when I was writing for Women's Agenda. Their campaigns for better paid parental leave and improved early childhood education and care struck a chord. In the various roles I held at Mamma Mia, at Marie Claire, in my column at The Herald, I wrote about their campaigns and their policy priorities often. This shared interest ultimately led to me joining the board in 2019. In May of 2020, when the federal government took the extraordinary step of making early learning fee-free for parents, I stepped into the temporary role of campaign director. Making early learning fee-free was one thing, but having the Prime Minister and the Education Minister acknowledge early childhood education and care as an essential service and as fundamental to the education and development of children was thrilling. It was completely unprecedented. The arrangement wasn't perfect, with educators and providers bearing the brunt, but it represented a paradigm shift. Early education was actually being recognised as critical infrastructure. Our communities could not function without it. The campaign to prolong the fee-free period was unsuccessful, but once I'd got a taste for this role, I accepted an invitation from the board to take on the role as CEO. After more than a decade, commentating and reporting from the sidelines, it was time to get into the arena in a formal advocacy role. It was at the same time that the Thrive by 5 campaign kicked off. It was a febrile time, with the country still coming to grips with a pandemic that had rendered life as we knew it entirely different. It was also particularly febrile for women. While men and women right around the world contracted the virus, COVID, in equal numbers, men died in greater numbers. But in a social and economic sense, it was women right around the world who bore the disproportionate burden. COVID conspired with so many of the fault lines that make women's economic and social security precarious, and it compounded the damage. It exacerbated existing challenges and created a wider gulf of disadvantage, particularly for First Nations women, women with disability, LGBTIQ people, culturally and racially diverse women. Women were adversely affected by COVID on the front line, in the economic aftermath, and at home. Women were, as they remain, disproportionately represented in the workforces that were on the front line of the COVID crisis. As nurses, as aged carers, as disability support workers, as teachers, as early educators. Women dominated a lot of the jobs which couldn't be done from home. When COVID first hit, unemployment surged very quickly, and while both men and women were affected, women lost their jobs in greater numbers. In April 2020, 325,000 women became unemployed, representing 55% of all jobs lost. Female work hours reduced by 11.5%, compared to a 7.5% reduction in male hours during the same month. In Victoria in July 2020, the ABS figures showed that women lost jobs 5 times faster than men did. Here in New South Wales, it was double the rate. Women were congregated in industries hit hardest by COVID, and they were overrepresented in casual employment, which constituted a double whammy of job and income losses. In households with children, the social experiment known as lockdown created an additional 6 hours of work caring or supervising children. Let's talk about how well I did that, guys. Of those 6 hours, Lynn Craig's research found that in heterosexual nuclear families, women took on 4 hours of them, while men took on 2. On housework, the pattern is similar. Women on average took on an additional 70 minutes a day, while men did less than 30. This impacted the capacity of women to engage in paid work. Lots of women reduced their work hours during lockdown because it wasn't possible to work and care the way they needed to. This is a cohort of women who technically might not have lost their jobs or been on the front line, but they fell prey to COVID-19. We know tragically that almost 1 in 10 Australian women in a relationship experienced domestic violence during the COVID crisis. The Australian Institute of Criminology surveyed 15,000 women aged 18 years and older online in May 2020 about their experience of domestic violence. The research provides the most detailed information in the world about the prevalence and nature of domestic violence experienced by women during the pandemic. The data reveals that 4.6% of all women who responded to the survey and 8.8% of women in a cohabitating domestic relationship experienced physical violence from a current or former partner in the 3 months prior to the survey. Many women reported it was the first time their partner had been violent. For 33% of these women, this was the first time they had experienced physical violence within their relationship. Despite the well-documented ways in which COVID was presenting particular difficulties for women, much of the recovery efforts were aimed at men. It was the high-vis recovery. We saw construction workers receive million-dollar packages, while early childhood educators, who are among the lowest paid workers in the country, were the only cohort of workers in Australia to have JobKeeper taken off them. There were other cohorts of workers who were never eligible in the first place for JobKeeper, but early childhood educators were the only workforce who initially had access to JobKeeper and had it turned off. This was the context in which the then biggest spending budget in Australia's history was handed down in October of 2020. 1/3 of 1% of the total budget spend went to women's economic security. $240 million out of $215 billion. This was called out immediately on news publications across the spectrum, and all declared convincingly that women were the biggest losers in the budget. Liz Broderick famously said, if you don't intentionally include women in policies, you will unintentionally exclude them. And the October 2020 budget, whether it was intentional or not, excluded women. To say women were mad was an understatement. It was my first federal budget in this role, and it was hectic. After writing a furious op-ed on the Tuesday night for Women's Agenda, criticising the budget's failure to address the systemic drivers of women's economic security, I woke up on Wednesday primed for a media onslaught. I did at least 5 TV interviews from our house because it was COVID. I did 7 radio segments. I provided lines to about 8 print journalists, and I recorded a podcast. This was between managing 3 children in 3 different locations on account of it being school holidays. When an unknown number flashed up on my phone, I thought nothing of it. This phone call wasn't, however, like the others. It was a senior member of staff in the Prime Minister's office. They didn't appreciate my criticism of the budget. I was told I was a public figure and what I said mattered. I should correct the record. I was told this budget is for all Australians. Did I know the tax cuts applied to women and men? As a matter of fact, I did know that. And I said, that is correct. But unless women and men are earning the same amount of money, the benefit from that tax cut will not flow to men and women equally. I was told, did I know, there are a whole range of reasons women choose not to work as much as men. Which point I said, yes, and if you had read any of the submissions that we and so many other organisations have made ahead of this budget, you might do something about those structural drivers. It was a really heated conversation. And at the time, I really was honestly thinking, I wonder if the person on the other end of this call has ever done a multiple child pickup in the middle of their working day. And I might be wrong, but I am pretty confident they've never done that. The conversation ended with a killer line, as Wendy alluded to. When I said, Also, can we just talk about the fact I'm not the only person who's describing this budget as terrible for women? And I was told no one credible was criticising the budget. I disagreed and promptly messaged as many women as possible, a broad church, and I gave them a very quick rundown of the conversation I just had. I made a suggestion: add credible women to any budget-related tweets or posts on social media. I should say that it wasn't about any women in particular being more elite than anyone else. My point was that as women, we are credible human beings, we are part of this community, and we actually count, every single one of us. It doesn't matter what your job title is. And I turned my phone off for an hour while I recorded a podcast. And when I turned that phone back on and I saw that credible women was trending on Twitter, I was very, very happy. It stayed as the #1 trending subject on Twitter in Australia for days. And that felt significant. It felt like women collectively had gained a tiny bit of power. We had been completely ignored in a really significant budget at a point in time where we did not need to be ignored. I liked how that felt. The next day, another really significant turning point occurred. The opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, made a bold pledge and commitment in his budget reply. He said, Labor created Medicare, universal healthcare. We created the NDIS, universal support for people with a disability. We created superannuation, universal retirement savings for workers. And if I'm Prime Minister, I will make quality, affordable childcare universal too. It wasn't just a line. There was a package that went with it. A major reform of the childcare subsidy was announced that recognised the high cost of early education and care and the impact it had on women and children. The commitment was, if elected, they would ask the Productivity Commission to investigate how universal early childhood education and care could be delivered. It is hard to overstate the significance of this commitment. Early childhood education and care was finally on the map. It was being affirmed as a credible structural barrier that we need to address. We know that still not being able to access or afford quality early childhood education and care remains the single biggest impediment to women's workforce participation in Australia. For many of the 80,000 parents and carers in the parenthood community, this is not just an abstract hypothetical. It's their reality. Inaccessible or unaffordable early learning is a barrier that impacts families day to day. And it's not just about money. It is about money because when you can't go to work, you can't earn an income and you can't provide for your family. But it's about much more than money. It's about families having a connection to another community, to support. We know the adage that it takes a village to raise a child, and the reality is so many families are raising children right now without a village. And we know that high quality early childhood education and care can be and should be an incredible part of the village that every family in Australia can rely on. Our mission at the Parenthood is really deliberately to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent, because it is only when parents and caregivers are supported that children can thrive. For children to thrive and lead happy, healthy and productive lives, they need support, and so do their parents and carers. Becoming a parent is a wonderful, life-changing experience, but it is not without challenges. It is never more wild than being a first-time parent, inexplicably responsible for a teeny human with no operating manual. We know that parenting and raising children matters. Every child in every household shapes our future. In raising children, parents and carers and communities have the future in their hands. We know that by the age of 5, 90% of a child's brain is fully developed. The early years set the foundations for lifelong, optimal health, educational, well-being and economic outcomes. And yet too often, the reality of raising children, of supporting children, of educating and nurturing children is minimised, it's dismissed, It's trivialised. It's taken for granted. And yet we know that the health, development and well-being of young children is inextricably linked with the health and well-being of their parents and caregivers. 20% of mothers experience depression and anxiety in the perinatal period. We know that this is linked with adverse outcomes for children. We know, and this is one of the great tragedies of our country, that suicide is one of the leading causes of maternal death in Australia. Families in Australia don't find it difficult to raise a family and provide for a family because they're doing it wrong. They're not making the wrong choices. It's hard because our systems are not fit for purpose. We have not invested in the infrastructure that parents need to be able to move between their caring responsibilities with their work responsibilities. In 2021, the Parenthood commissioned a piece of research exploring what policies would make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent. There were two threshold questions. What are the policies that have the biggest positive impact on parents and children? And where does Australia rank in relation to them? The findings were compelling. Sadly, Australia lags the developed world in the provision of best practice evidence-based policies that support children, parents and families optimally. There are three key policies that could make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent and raise a child. These policies would also lift national productivity in the short and long term, reduce inequity and deliver better outcomes for children. These policies are adequate and equitable paid parental leave. A world-leading policy would offer 52 weeks of paid leave that's shared between parents. For context, in the OECD, the average length of paid leave that parents have access to is 50 weeks. In Australia at the moment, parents have access to 20 weeks at the minimum wage. So while 52 weeks is very generous, it would only put us in the average of the OECD. Universal access to affordable, quality and inclusive early childhood education and care that is delivered by a properly paid and qualified workforce, and family-friendly workplaces that offer flexibility and a culture that values parenting and caring among men and women. So they are the three key policies that Australia would need to pursue to become the best place in the world to be a parent. As Wendy said, we're not there yet, but we are working towards that outcome. After more than a decade of almost total stagnation, progress is now underway. The significance and credibility of both early childhood education and care and paid parental leave has been affirmed. We are now able to have a much better conversation about how we can implement these reforms rather than why. But there is another part of the why that I do want to talk to quickly. And it's something that I don't think is well enough understood. We know that in lots of ways, Australia is an incredibly lucky country. We know that we are a wealthy country. What is less known is the extent to which we are failing to support children. At present, 1 in 6 Australian children live in poverty and 1 in 5 start school developmentally vulnerable. In rural areas, it's 2 in 5 children who start school behind. Among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children half arrive at school developmentally vulnerable. The evidence is clear that children who start at school behind their peers rarely catch up. Australia is ranked 32nd out of 38 wealthy countries on child wellbeing measures. The long-term cost in social, health and economic terms to children, families, communities and the nation from failing in the early years is catastrophic. No credible conversation about growing the strength or sustainability of our nation, our communities, our economy can overlook the importance of children having access to quality early childhood education and care. It does change the trajectory of lives. We have a profound window between 0 and 5 where we can plant the seeds that set children up for lifelong success. After children turn 5, it's much harder. In 2019, a piece of research showed that we were spending at that point $15 billion every single year on late intervention. That is money that we could avoid spending if we got the early years right. There is absolutely no doubt that investing in high quality early childhood education and care is expensive. But I was at the Early Years Summit in Canberra earlier this year when Fiona Stanley made some profound observations in the beginning session. And she made the point that the cost of failure is so much higher than the highest cost of prevention. We have to make the upfront investment, and we are kidding ourselves if we don't acknowledge that we're already paying the price for not having done that. We know that early education and care is, in addition to being profoundly significant for the education and development of children, it is key to unlocking the full potential of the female workforce, to grow productivity, to improve human capital, to reverse the educational decline that we're seeing more broadly. Investing in early childhood education and care also presents a compelling and critical solution to the workforce shortages that are being experienced across the country. The government's cheaper childcare package that will take effect from the 1st of July will result in 8% more hours being worked by secondary earners with young children, mostly mums. Lowering the cost of care for these families will free up the equivalent of 44,000 additional full-time workers immediately. This potential workforce is right here. We don't need to bring them in from overseas. They're here. They are experienced, they're skilled, and they want to work more. Many of these cohort are already currently employed. They are women with children who are working 2 or 3 days a week because that's all they can afford. Of women in Australia aged between 25 and 40 with young children, just 56 participate in paid work. Of these, 61% work part-time, which is the highest rate of part-time work of any industrialised country. High rates of part-time work and lagging participation rates among women reflect that for too many families, the cost of care is so high or so inaccessible that two parents simply cannot afford to both work. It is almost invariably mums who reduce or stop their work as a result. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, recognised this economic insanity and made fixing it a centrepiece in the lead up to the May 2022 federal election. It remains a centrepiece of the government's economic and social reform agenda, and this is profoundly significant. It is so long overdue, but it is incredibly significant. We saw in May of 2022, the vast majority of Australians voted for either individuals or parties that were committed to meaningful action to reduce inequity. Early childhood education and care is one of those policies, and it is one of the policies that we have now got a majority of parliamentarians who are committed to. But, and this is a big but, to realise the benefits for children and the increased productivity for the country, we need an early childhood education and care workforce that can deliver the early childhood education and care that children need and that their parents need. Turnover in early education has always been high, sitting around 20%, which is considerably higher than the 12% rate in education generally. In the past year, turnover has accelerated sharply, and some services have reported turnover rates between 30 and 40%. There are at least 20,000 vacancies in early childhood education and care right now. We saw staff vacancies more than double since COVID hit. Now, every unfilled educator role impacts between 7 to 12 families. Right now, nationally, 16.4% of all long daycare services are operating with a waiver because they don't have the staff they need under the National Quality Framework. In Queensland and in Western Australia, it's 25% of long daycare services have a waiver in place because they cannot get the staff they need. This workforce contracting is a problem for every child, every employer, and every organisation in the country. Because when parents cannot access suitable quality early education and care, they cannot access work. And if a child cannot access quality early education and care before they start school, they are far more likely to arrive at school developmentally vulnerable, and they will struggle to catch up over the course of their life. Without early childhood educators and teachers, there is no early education. Without accessible, affordable, suitable early childhood education and care, there can be no increased productivity, no tapping into the great unrealised iron ore deposit that is female workforce participation, no systemic erosion of inequity, and no chance to give every child in Australia access to the life-changing benefits of quality early learning. The most significant obstacle that stands between where Australia is on these measures and where we could stand on these measures is a strong and sustainable early childhood education and care workforce. This is the moment we need to confront the reasons that early educators are leaving. We cannot ignore that in this sector, as with so many female-dominated workforces, skilled, valuable and demanding work is paid considerably less than less skilled, less valuable and less demanding work. The award in early education commences with a rate of pay for a qualified Certificate 3 educator of $23.39 per hour. For a centre director, a role that is often degree qualified, the award starts at $35.17 per hour. For context, the average median hourly rate in Australia is $41 an hour. The average take-home pay for an early educator in Australia is $1,059 a week. This compares with an entry-level building labourer with no Certificate 3, who on average takes home $1,550 per week. A survey of 4,000 early educators in late 2021 showed that 73% of the workforce plan to leave within the next 3 years. Pay is undoubtedly a big factor, but so too are rising stress levels, not feeling valued, not feeling respected, and not enjoying secure employment. We are now in a vicious cycle. All of the educators that remain, who are operating with waivers, are trying to do more with less. We know that the burnout is real, and it's getting perpetually worse. Early educators are leaving because they feel like they cannot afford financially or mentally to stay, and none of us can afford that. Not children, not parents, not employers, not governments. It is time to make the necessary investment in this critical piece of nation-building infrastructure, not just in making early childhood education and care more affordable and more accessible and better quality, but ensuring we have a strong, sustainable and growing workforce. And if there is the concern at this point about the cost attached to this investment, we have to remind ourselves that the cost of inaction is higher. We are already paying for a system that doesn't work well enough. The average Australian woman misses out on $693,000 in income and $180,000 in super over the course of her life due to inadequate parenting policies. When you consider that at the moment the average super balance for a woman over 50 is $200,000, an additional $180,000 over the course of their working life is incredibly significant. That is the motherhood penalty in Australia, and it's individual mums who foot that bill. And it's not just a financial cost, it's a social cost. It's the lack of safety, it's the lack of agency. If you have no financial security, you have no security. As I said, we spend at least $15 billion every year on late intervention for children. We know that for every dollar we invest in early education, we get at least $2 in return. We know that for children with any form of disadvantage, the return is more like $7 for every dollar spent. That's an investment. And there is not a person or organisation in Australia that won't benefit from us making this investment now in an early childhood education and care system that works. The evidence is incontrovertible. The moment is finally upon us. It will pay for itself time and time again. It will help solve at once a number of the most significant economic and social challenges we're facing. The question is, thankfully, no longer if we should implement this bold reform, but when. And the only credible answer is now. By the end of this year, the Productivity Commission will hand down its interim report, mapping out a path to universal access for early childhood education and care. My hope is that the report that is handed down will reflect the enormity of this opportunity. My hope is it's a report that Maybanke Anderson could read and feel safe and relieved that her vision from more than 100 years ago is that much closer to being realised.
Thank you, Georgie, for that wonderful lecture. There were some wonderful points made, and I won't repeat them. What I would like to say was that you've said that funding for advocacy is critical, and I am just thrilled that you have taken the career path that you have to make you the credible woman that you are, to advocate for all of us. I'm sure that many of us will reflect long on the lecture that we have just heard. I now have far more insights into those cars I see on the road in the early morning with distracted-looking women full of children. And I'll be very respectful because I do appreciate that this is a very hard road for women, for educators, and we have a long way to go to make sure that we're not ranked 70th in the world and that our women are on a par with our men in terms of achieving their productive potential. It is clearly incredibly important for our economy and our society, and I'm so pleased that you've made this contribution to the Maybanke pantheon of speakers, and you are right up there with all of the others in terms of making a difference for women. Thank you very much. As I wrap up this event, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a fundraising event. There are some donation cards on seats, and you can always search Donate Maybanke Fund to find the right link. Your support will allow more scholarships for Indigenous teachers in training and wider support to causes that Maybanke championed, which is still current in Sydney today. Thank you everyone for your support this evening. I would like to particularly thank, and I have some flowers, Yvonne Weldon for coming this evening and for her recognition of my aunt Ros at the City of Sydney. And I would particularly like to thank you, Georgie, not just for preparing this wonderful lecture, but also for your support to me in putting this lecture on this first time, making sure that we had a good number of people attending and from promoting the event. I'm extraordinarily appreciative of that assistance. And finally, I'd particularly like to thank the Sydney Community Foundation team, Loredana Fife, Jodie Strecklassen, who are in New York but have been helping from afar, even in the last 24 hours, and to volunteers, Belle Walker, Sarah Verne, Viv Strong, and my mother. Thanks everyone for coming. There'll now be some photos and an opportunity for those present to chat. Thank you everyone for attending the lecture, and good night.